Amplifier, an undeniable climate emergency podcast.
Today we talk with Dr. Elkanah Babatunde, a research fellow in the University of Cape Town's Global Risk Governance Program. He focuses on climate justice in Africa and global environmental governance. We dig into the challenges for burgeoning nations in transitioning away from fossil fuels and the many hypocrisies of the global north lecturing Africa on how they should organize that transition. Naturally, to benefit the global north rather than the people of Africa. It was a great conversation with a really fascinating thinker. I hope you'll join us. Elkanah, welcome. Really excited to have this conversation with you. I think the areas that you focus on when we look at the possibility of a transition to a fossil fuel-free future, to dealing with climate change, I think the questions of a just transition aren't just morally necessary, they're practically necessary. And I think you live right in the middle of that work. So I'm really eager to dive in and find out your thoughts, particularly in the light of the recent COP conferences and looking forward. So welcome to Amplifier.
Thank you very much for having me.
Would love for you just to kind of introduce and tell folks your area of work and how you arrived at that area of work. Just talk about some of your background and what brought you in towards the explain the areas of work that you do and what brought you into them.
All right, thank you so much. So I'm Elkanah Babatunde, and I'm a research fellow with the Global Risk Governance Program at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. And I work within the intersection of public international law and climate justice and just transition to a fossil fuel economy. And my journey to this field actually started when I joined the Global Risk Governance Program. And my background is in human rights, so your typical first level rights, like right to vote, right to life, that sort of stuff. And when I joined, really the first project that I worked on was around policing and yet respecting people's human rights and the right to protest and things like that, and how policing can be done while respecting those things. And at some point in the organization, our work began to shift to the policing of environmental crimes. So, you have people who smuggle, animal parts, endangered species and all of that. So our work began to shift into the criminality around the environment, how to preserve endangered species and biodiversity. And one of the things that I began to see was the decline in the quality of the human environment. There was an increased need for a variety of reasons that we probably cannot go into now, but there was an increased need for these different endangered species that by law people were supposed to preserve. But there still is a whole criminal world around that. But very soon my focus also began to shift. We can actually see animals being killed. We can actually see parts of animals being trafficked from Southern Africa, whether it's the rhino trade, to Asia, and that belt, you can see it. It's visible in the physical form. But then there's also a part of the human environment that we're using up, and that was, the atmosphere. That was how my focus began to change to climate change and the governance of climate change. And it also coincided with the period that the Paris Agreement was being ratified at the Conference of the Parties in Paris. So my focus really started from that, your general human rights to policing and human rights, to the policing of environmental crimes, and then to, the invisible, non-visual aspect of the environment, which is climate change. And for me as an African and somebody who spent most of my life in Africa, one of the questions that I began to ask is, we cannot continue with fossil fuels. for several reasons, it's responsible for a lot of the human security issues and armed conflicts that takes place in different parts of Africa. But also just for the sake of preserving the human environment and the quality of environment that we have to live in. So in Nigeria, for example, crude oil is responsible for majority, I think over 90% of the foreign reserve that the country has. And when we begin to think of a fossil-free economy, what happens? How does the country replace its source of foreign revenue? So for me, that conflict began to play on in my head. The need to transition, but also the need to protect the economy for the people. The need to know that people still need jobs. The need to know that the government still need funds to, better roads and all of that. But also you cannot say, oh, we'll protect the economy and destroy the people or destroy the environment. So since the 1950s, when oil began to be extracted in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, there's been rivers that have been polluted. I'm not even talking about the top level climate change. I'm talking even the physical form where there's been oil spillage. There's been acid rain in parts of this region. So there's a need to begin to rethink, how do we drive the economy? How do we provide energy? How do we get, whatever money is needed to run the economy without destroying the people and the environment in the process? And I saw that for African countries, there really were no easy choices. There really were no easy answers. So that also led me into how did we come about this problem? What's the origin of this problem? And how are African countries and the African region as a whole, where are we situated in this problem? And that informed my doctoral research, where I did a mapping of climate change treaties from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, in 1992 to 2015 when the Paris Agreement was passed. And the main objective was to see, is there a common thing? Is there a common argument? Is there a common interest that African countries, whether in their individual submission or their joint submission, is there a common thing that they are pushing for? Is there a common voice? Is there a common interest that we can say, oh, as far as African countries or even specific countries are concerned, this is our primary interest. This is what we're pushing for. And what I argued for in that thesis was African countries are interested in climate change. African countries are interested in a just transition. But it should be one that the principles of equity are applied and abided with.
So many critical points that you brought up. I mean, one thing is when you look at human rights and physical well-being, one of the worst places to be born is in a petrostate, right? Mm. It just generally, because of I'd say the colonial relations between the fossil fuel industry and petrostates, the corruption, the physical despoilation, that it's generally a horrible outcome for the citizenry, for the people of countries where something like Nigeria, 90% of the foreign reserves comes from the oil trade, and that to me points to both. And I think that we can look at all of these relations, and I would say that the countries where oil deposits were found that didn't already have a strong position in the international order just became kind of vassal states, if you will, right? They were seen as places to be exploited, and the population's kind of disposable. Certainly, I think a lot of what happens in the Nigerian Delta could be described as genocidal, right? I mean, what Shell Oil has Absolutely. Done there in terms of just destroying the ability for people to survive, Absolutely. Literally, let alone have their traditional livings. But it also feels like and I think there's a very insidious argument made by kind of the soft denialists that if we were to get off of fossil fuels, we would rob underdeveloped countries of the ability to develop. Although I'd love to hear what you think about it. I like, the term overexploited countries is a lot more accurate, or over-extracted countries. Stolen from, looted, pillaged countries is a little bit more, puts a little bit more of the blame than underdeveloped.
So that argument is one that we hear very
sorry, go
often.
ahead.
But probably
please.
a way to start is to ask those who make that argument is, who is benefiting? Who are the primary beneficiaries of the current exploitation? It's not the people. So using the people as a defense to say we have to continue the use of extraction of fossil fuels, it's a lie. It's hypocrisy. Because they are not the primary beneficiaries. What do they get from the extraction of crude oil, for example? They get rivers with oil spillage where no fish or fauna can grow. They get their farmlands that get polluted and they can no longer plant. They get their activists who say, well, Shell, you need to do something. The federal government, you need to do something about it. What happened? They get jailed. Some of them get killed. The memory of Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was killed by the military regime, is still very fresh in the minds of a lot of people. So that's what the people get from the extraction of this fossil fuel. So to use the people as the reason to continue this extraction is it's a lie. It's false. The people are not benefiting from it. What the people would benefit from is a just transition, a transition away from this fossil fuel. In fact, what you see is that when it comes to even, because the argument a lot of people would use is employment. And I do get employment. I do get the defense that, some people are employed in the oil industry. And for the sake of those people, we have to continue and all of that. But the truth is, when you look at the levels of employment that the locals especially are involved in, it's pretty low level. So the top engineers are people who primarily would come from Netherlands, the UK, the US, and all of that. They don't use local talent that much. But also, when we're talking about just transition within the energy sector, we're not saying there would no longer be an energy industry. We're only saying that there needs to be an energy industry that protects the people and protects the environment. And the people who we say, but they are employed in the oil industry, they could still be subsumed in whatever sustainable alternative to crude oil that there is.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that people who argue this, that moving off of fossil fuels would trap much of the world in poverty, they're never also saying, well, the first step should be to nationalize those resources, right? They're not saying, if they're really interested in the well-being and they're saying fossil fuels are critical, well, then Shell should be out of Nigeria and the oil industry should be nationalized, right? That's the logical connection. They never make that connection. So the disingenuous nature of their argument, I think, is pretty clear, that it's just there to try and guilt people who are concerned about climate into slowing down action. I mean, I think it's as simple. I do think I think it's insidious because I think it can impact people who are trying to do the right thing, who are interested in a just transition, and they worry about leaving people behind. But I think it's completely disingenuous. Yeah. I mean, I'd love to hear, because I think that what it points to is, that we're obviously in a period of ecological crisis. It's not the future. It's now, when you look at, certainly across Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and droughts and the degradation of the ecosystems, like you were talking about, the oil spills and the extreme heat that's going to put millions of lives at danger. We're already in it, right? We're already in the climate emergency. We're already in the ecological emergency. But there's also, it strikes me that there's an enormous opportunity. And one of the things that I think, beyond just the short-term profits of the fossil fuel industry, is that fossil fuels are ownable and controllable, right?
Yeah.
They come from a well. They have to get put on a ship and shipped. You can fuel your army with it. You can stop other people from fueling their armies with it. That's that it's units of energy that can be locked up, sold, and traded. And renewable energy has the potential of being ubiquitous, right? It can be
It's more communal.
available and not controllable.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, because I think that's one of the opportunities, also one of the threats that goes beyond just the fossil fuel industry profits, which are enormous.
Yeah.
What study came out, $3 billion a day for the last 50 years. But this different nature of what renewable energy and what that can mean in terms of democracy and the development of civil society in countries that have been dependent on fossil fuel extraction.
No, absolutely. So I think one of the big issues that you've raised in what you just said is around property rights, right? So when it comes to fossil fuels, there are clear property rights, right? So there are clear rights as to who owns an oil field, who owns the tanker, who owns what, right? There's clear property rights. The law on property rights has been existing for 200 years or more. So there's clear ownership. Right, but for renewable energy, it doesn't seem to be as yet clear, right? So I cannot say, oh, I own this amount of wind, or I own this amount of this percentage of the solar system. That would be ridiculous, right? So even in terms of the democratization of energy, the turn to a sustainable use of the environment really offers an opportunity for a more democratized system. Now, does this mean that there would not be individual wealth? Absolutely not. So, because the tendency is to pick sustainability against the economy. It's like, oh no, if we get more sustainable, the economy will get destroyed. Or no, individual rights will still be protected, but so will communal rights. So the move to sustainability does not threaten any individual, but it protects the communal. So yes, there may not be clear property rights the way you have it for, say, I can say, oh, I own this oil field. Perhaps I would not be able to say that I own this amount of wind. But I still have the necessary protection, but while ensuring that the majority of the people are also protected. So what we're going to see is a democratization of energy, a democratization of the sources of energy. And that's not a bad thing in any way. In fact, for a region like Africa, where most people have very limited political power, it's the kind of thing that we should be looking at embracing. So while, yes, it's accurate to say that fossil fuel have a better established property rights system that protects ownership, and the legal systems governing renewable energy may not be as well established as that, but at the same time, it doesn't threaten individual liberties in any way. Instead, it provides communal ownership and the democratization of our energy sources. And that's not a bad thing. That's not something that anybody should be resistant to.
Yeah, I think it's a key thing to human survival, honestly, the democratization, because that very centralized control of ownership over fossil fuels has led to the point where we're threatening human life on Earth, other life on Earth, and where most people are clearly not benefiting. So yeah, that democratization seems, but I also do think that realistically that's behind a lot of the political and police and military resistance to getting off of fossil fuels is that very democratization, which I think I'm terrible at proper quoting, but there's the Marx quote of, if people could live on sunshine and oxygen, then you wouldn't need capitalism. I mean, on some level, we're seeing that potential around energy, right? The amount of renewable energy could be such that energy could be virtually free relative to how it works in the world now, and what that would unleash in terms of human productivity and democratization could be extraordinary.
Yeah.
So really, this democratization of energy could open up a whole new world.
Yes, and for a region that has over 60% of its population living below poverty level, that's not a bad thing. Having
It's a
energy
wonderful
being
thing.
available at that level, it's something that we should embrace. It's something that at the global level should be encouraged.
Yeah. Well, just think of the health, life expectancy, the productivity, the innovation that could be available if these areas that have been cut off from energy suddenly had more energy than they know what to do with. I mean, it could fundamentally change the story across Africa and across the world in terms
The
of the most
productivity
vulnerable.
levels are just going to jump so high, and it's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And survival in a world that's heating and, just the ability to cool the air when the temperatures are so dangerous. I mean, so we're also talking about survival, right? That ability to get democratized access to energy is about thriving, but it's also about surviving, like just basic human survival. I mean, it feels, we are moving out of the current system, right? One way or another, as I see it, right? We're already in some level, the system is in forms of collapse right now when you look at the pace of climate impact is increasing. It's not just that things are getting worse, they're getting worse and they're getting worse faster. Things as they are not sustainable. And we're seeing the cracks around the edges, and pandemics are just one sign of that. Super droughts are another sign of that. Extreme heat events, on and on and on and on. So it feels like we are transitioning into something new. The question is what? And I'd love to hear your thoughts, because when I look at what's going on, the potential here is, I mean, Africa has been, of course, severely underdeveloped by centuries of colonial relationships, and those haven't ended. I mean, Shell is still in Nigeria despoiling, the mineral extraction leading to conflict. I mean, across the line, the colonial age has morphed and changed, but never ended, right? And that's still something that incredibly impacts the lives of people across the continent. It strikes me that when we are transitioning, because the current order, we can't keep doing what we're doing. We just know that. The science is there. I mean, climate scientists are now just coming out and saying human civilization can't withstand this degree of continuing to burn fossil fuels. So something is going to change. I'd love to hear your thoughts, because it strikes me that there's an enormous opportunity to actually transcend a lot of the negative impacts of colonization and resource extraction across Africa in a way that, we saw leapfrogging over landlines in Africa when mobile networks came in and people didn't have to go through this stage of laying down lines for telephones. The same thing with energy, that there's this potential to leapfrog over the dirty era of economic development based on fossil fuels and actually move much faster ahead in a more democratic way. So anyways, there was kind of a long way around to a question of your thoughts about the opportunities that are presented by a transition off of fossil fuel for Africa.
Yes, there's a lot of opportunity. The way that I say it, you've made a very good illustration with the telecommunications, where you didn't have to go through the whole process and all of that. You could just save about 50 to even 70 years of telecommunications history, just joining or jumping to the handheld cell phones that we use today. And I see a lot of that also. I'm not sure if you're the one I was talking to a few weeks ago, but about energy. That's an area I'm concerned about: energy and human security. So I would use two examples for that. The first one is, so in Nigeria, for example, and I will use Nigeria and perhaps South Africa a lot in my examples. Don't get tired of hearing Nigeria and South Africa. but in Nigeria, there is, for the past 60, 70, maybe even 100 years, there's been a southward migration of cattle rearers from the north to the middle belt region of the country. But it's been seasonal. So what happens is, as the rain moves southwards, because these cattle rearers need the grass for grazing their animals, they sort of move with the move of the rain to make sure that there's grass available for the people. And then they usually move northwards again once it gets rainier in the north. But because of climate change in the last few years, there's been increased desertification. And what that means is that there's been a lot of desert encroachment. So in parts of the north where they could easily have gotten grass some 40, 50, 60 years ago, now it's all desert. But what that means is that there's now more pressure on the resources of the middle belt, where you have cattle rearers migrating, but not just seasonal now. The migration is becoming for a longer period of time. But then in the middle belt themselves, you have people who are indigenous to those communities, who own rights, farming rights, and they have their farms over that community. And then now there's been migrating cattle rearers contesting for that space. And there's been a lot of clash. And I think over the last 10 years, over 10,000 lives, and I'm probably cutting that number much smaller than it is, that's been lost to clash between the original owners of the Middle Belt region, who have farmed there for generations, and the seasonal migrants who are beginning to want to settle in these lands. Now, that seems like a human security issue. Communal clash against cattle rearers. But what I see in that is an opportunity for us. How do we rethink how our cattle are reared? The whole migration thing, making cattle move, it's not productive even from a strictly agricultural point of view. But that's a problem that we probably would never have looked at if the climate change problem of desertification did not point our eyes to it. Mm-hmm. So that is climate change helping us see that there's a need for us to do something different in our agriculture. Because climate change is now threatening our traditional ways of doing agriculture. So that's a huge opportunity that we need to begin to rethink. Grazing, as has been done, is no longer sustainable because climate change has led to desertification. But by pointing into that, we solve the human security problem, because by addressing that issue, we're able to address the clash between the original Middle Belt owners of the land and the migrating Fulani cattle rearers. You solve the human security problem, but also it's an opportunity for a more productive agricultural production. So that's climate change pointing our eyes to the fact that we need to do something different about our agriculture. And then my lovely topic that I love to talk about, access to electricity. Access to electricity. There's a need to rethink that. Currently, South Africa is facing a huge electricity crisis, where they're having blackouts for up to 4, 5, 6 hours in a day. And the end does not seem to be in sight. What's the primary source of electricity in South Africa? Coal. Mm. Again, this is an opportunity for us to begin to rethink. How do we generate our electricity? The dependence on coal is not sustainable. How do we address this problem? How do we do electricity differently? So those are just two examples that are close to my heart and that are very obvious, that you don't even need to make a very deep argument to get to the point that climate change is giving us an opportunity to leap and save ourselves years of development. We could just jump. What's the best, most productive way of doing agriculture today, without having to go through the different transition from one episode to another? And in doing that, you're solving an agricultural problem, but you're also solving a human security problem. And likewise with electricity.
And and those are just two examples. It strikes me that as we look at every crisis presented by climate change and ecological breakdown, there's similar opportunities everywhere to actually improve lives, to create sustainable employment, because people do need to work and to support themselves. But it strikes me that we're going to see those kinds of opportunities at every turn.
But it also points to the fact that we are sitting on gunpowder if we do not take action.
No, please.
Because like you rightly said,
continue.
There's going to be more opportunities like this, but there are opportunities that if we do not take, there are also disasters in waiting.
Yes.
So it shows that action needs to be taken. We are at a very pivotal point in human history and in African history specifically, where we have an opportunity to do something differently and save ourselves and even jump in productivity, or we lose it. We lose that opportunity and, it could be disaster.
And another area that I think is really interesting to me is the fact that the move to a renewable future is going to require, and is requiring already, the extraction of rare earth minerals and other resources. And the historical model has been one of, again, a colonial relationship where the countries with the resources don't benefit. The population doesn't benefit from the extraction, just ecological devastation. And there seems, because the world is becoming increasingly reliant on the ability to extract these resources, there's again the opportunity to shift the economic relationship where countries can actually have control over these resources, and accountability treaties include that accountability that the wealth generated from their extraction is done maintaining the health and actually sharing those resources with the population. That's going to be central. That's going to be central. Otherwise, I think we just collapse into greater chaos. So the question is, how do we push through, and how do we get treaties and agreements that and enforced on the ground that actually see these rare earth minerals that are essential to the survival of humanity don't actually end up in more devastation, despoilation, and impoverishment of the people where the resources exist, right? Just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay. So let me be sure I understand you clearly. I think the question is around how do we ensure that the human need and greed to control things does not lead to a situation where even in the transition, the people who should benefit are excluded. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And specifically, how do we build international structures so that the extraction of the resources needed to transition to a clean energy future are that the balance of power and economics are shifted away from the colonial model, right? Where like oil in Nigeria, it led to despoilation, despoiling of homelands and impoverishment of people. How do we flip that script? Because the world needs these rare earth minerals to produce windmills and solar panels and all of the technology that we're going to need to get off of fossil fuels. But how do we not repeat the same history of colonization where the people who hold those resources actually don't benefit from
them? Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. So I think one of the reasons why we got to where we are with the current mode of production is when you look at the history of the relationship between Africa and most of the global north, it was an unequal one. So it's one that was established based on colonization. So the very root of it was based on oppression, was based on domination. But here we have an opportunity to reimagine things. So the first climate change treaty, for example, the UNFCCC in 1992, African countries had an opportunity to be there, to be there as independent countries. Of course, the political power still is imbalanced, but they had representation. Now compare that with the United Nations Charter of 1945, right? Where most of the African countries were still colonial powers, colonial extension of the European powers. So, whereas at the very foundation of the United Nations Charter is colonization, is countries that, as they began to get independence in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, they just joined the United Nations that started while they were, vassal states. But with the climate change treaty, it's a little different in that it's starting, and these agreements are being entered into at a point where, at least at the de jure level, African countries are independent. So there's an opportunity for that, and you will see that in the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and each of the conference of the parties, there's a strong voice for climate justice. There's a strong voice for ensuring that weaker countries, small island countries, countries that are threatened by climate change, and countries that do not have the same historic industrial privileges are catered for. Now, that's one thing. The implementation, and perhaps that's what you're more concerned about, the implementation is another thing. And that's where real power comes to be. Okay, we can give you what you want in the text. You look at the UNFCCC, African countries have the protection in the text. The same with the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol. In the text, there is some protection.
Yes.
There is, there seems to be at least an international recognition of these issues of protecting weak states that you have mentioned. But it's one thing for it to be in the text. It's another thing for it to be, actually practiced. And I think that's where African countries do need to use their agency a little more by insisting on some of these things. And we've seen an example. I believe it was in 2011 at the Conference of the Parties that was hosted in Durban, South Africa, where African countries actually walked out of one of the negotiations because countries of the global north were not being cooperative. And the conversation could not move ahead. From my perspective, that's a good thing because you're exercising your agency. So that's one. Now, on the side of the global north and people who have most of the technology that's needed, I think there's a need for conversations like one that we're having now, where people gain a better understanding of climate change is different from global poverty. And I would explain that. There could be somebody at the other end of say, Borno State, which is, I think, one of the northeasternmost regions of Nigeria, who is experiencing poverty, and somebody else is in their mansion in Victoria Island, and they are not feeling it. We do not necessarily have to share global poverty, but climate change is different in that it's general. Nobody is spared. So for countries and even companies who have these technologies, there's a need for a proper understanding that it's a communal problem. It's a problem that we all have to take responsibility for, and we all have to take action for. So no country or no company can say, well, we are far away removed from the problem, we cannot be concerned. No, you can. You have to be. Not just because of the history of the problem and where most of the emissions come from, but also the fact that the consequences are going to be global. A child is hungry in another end of the world. You probably would not be hungry if you have your food to eat. But it's not the same with the climate change problem. The consequences are going to be global. So nobody, we can't create these silos, these islands of effectiveness where we are far removed from the problem. Climate change is very unique in that it's global, and you cannot be as far removed from the problem as you want to be. So there's a need for joint action. There's a need for joint responsibility.
Absolutely. I mean, the sad irony is that the countries that have historically contributed the most emissions in Western Europe and North America have to date been the least impacted, and the places across the world where the least emissions have been created have been most impacted, right? That's worsened this. It's a cruel irony. But as you say, it is a common problem because, we have, I mean, we're going to have to change this terminology. A once in 1,200 year drought in the Southwest in the U.S. now. I mean, all the once in 1,000 years, once in 100 years that are now regular occurrences. Seems like we need another way of describing this. But once in a 1,200 year super drought in the Southwest. We've had fires take out entire towns in the Northeast. Extreme weather events here as well, and that this commonality is the fact that these impacts are ramping up globally, and even if they're continuing to hurt some of the most vulnerable in the least emitting areas, they are in fact hitting everyone. It is a social problem. So one of the and I think that, I mean, if we don't work towards a just transition, I don't see having the social stability to be able to carry out a transition at all, right? So this question of a just transition across the world, to me, is a practical matter. It's a moral matter, and I think, being a settler in the United States, and the United States' history of exploitation of other people's resources, there's an absolute ethical and a moral level where people in the global north should be looking for this just transition inside their countries and internationally. It's a clear-cut moral, ethical case, but it's also extremely practical, because I think if we don't have that just transition, we probably won't get a transition.
Yeah.
Right? We'll be more likely to go into eco-fascism globally, which is rather than a thriving post-fossil fuel world.
Sure.
So to me, that question of just transition and people in the global north taking responsibility should also be seen as a form of self-preservation. That this kind of democratization of energy, this kind of leapfrogging over the impacts of colonization is actually self-preservation.
Absolutely.
Globally.
Absolutely. And I think that's also the main argument for those who say, those who want to do this economy versus sustainability thing. Sustainability is good for the economy. Sustainability is not just good for the environment; it's good for the economy. We talked about how the democratization of energy, and places who do not have electricity now having more energy than they could even know what to do with it. That's not just addressing an inequality issue. It's also addressing an economy issue, because now these are small scale farmers who could now do more with the energy they have. This could be small scale tin producers who could now do more. This could be people who, whatever it is that they did, this improves their productivity. So just trying to buttress the point that it's not just a moral obligation that we have. It's not just, the typical human rights, this is the correct thing to do thing, but it's good for the economy. It's just transition is not just moral, it's also practical, it's also economical. If we want to save the economy, this is the thing to do.
I mean, I think it really also then we have to define what is the function of the economy, because there's a lot of conversation in the climate movement about degrowth. And I'm not certain I've always had a resistance to that term, because so many people need growth, economic growth still, to be able to raise their living standards. To me, it's a question of what do we mean by growth, right? Is growth, what's the function of the economy? Is it to extract in the short term as much wealth as possible and concentrate it in a handful of hands? That kind of growth is killing us and won't last, right? It's just going to collapse like a house of cards. But if we look at what...
Yeah, and that kind of growth is responsible for most of the inequality that we see today. It's the primary reason why we have as much inequality. It's that that consumer dense definition of economic growth, it's responsible for the inequality. It's responsible even for the environmental problem itself.
But imagine if a rural community that doesn't have access to electricity suddenly has all the energy they need. Their kids can study at night without burning something that's going to shorten lifespans because of particulate matter, whether that's kerosene or dung or whatever, depending on the region and the area, whatever it is. And that energy can be used to significantly increase agricultural output or create small businesses or technical innovation or moving into new fields. Suddenly you're looking at growth in a way that's not about extraction. It actually, and this is true in an individual societal level, but it's also true on a broader social level, which is being poor is expensive, right? Poverty is expensive. Like when you can't afford a good pair of shoes that'll last 10 years, you spend more buying crappy shoes that fall apart because you can't make that investment. And that's true in infrastructure when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to all sorts of things. So being poor is expensive. And when people are trapped in poverty, it's hugely expensive. You see people, if they don't have access to energy, stripping away undergrowth in order to get and deforestation in order to get enough energy just to cook food and potentially boil water if they don't have access to safe water and so forth. Being poor is expensive. It's expensive for the individual in society, because they can't afford, if you don't have access to good health care, it's more expensive to be sick than it is to have preventative health care. But that also works on a social level where being poor is expensive because you may be stripping resources like deforestation just to get fuel for cooking and boiling water or whatnot. And that to me is a different kind of growth, which is if we can provide the resources that people in extreme poverty need, their economy grows exponentially, but we actually may be preserving the social resources. So that growth can do the opposite, right? It can do the opposite. It can lift people out of poverty, but actually lower the social and the environmental cost of lifting them out of poverty. And that to me is, again, one of those huge opportunities that is just not about that growth is bad. It's that an extractive growth is bad, an exploitative growth is bad. But there's a way to look at growing the economy for people who've been least able to participate in the wealth of capitalism over the last couple hundred years, that grows their economy but actually lowers that cost for the world, right?
Yeah, but I think that's an important distinction that within the context of this conversation, when we talk about the economy or we talk about growth, it's not primarily from an extractive point. It's the kind of growth that centers people. It's a kind of growth that asks the question, how best do we improve people's lives? So growth in economy for us is not just measured by numbers. What's the GDP last year? What's the GDP this year? No, it's humans at the center of it. It's about how many people did not have access to potable water, who now have it. How many people did not have access to electricity, who now have it. How many people, did not have access to healthcare, who now have it. How many kids could only read when it's daytime and there is sun, but now they can read at whatever hour they choose because they have access to light. That's so. Yes, I appreciate that distinction, that we're not talking about just the extraction where the economy grows by 10%, but actually we're talking about 2-3 billionaires moving from 90 billion to 100 billion. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people-centered growth, people-centered economy.
Yeah, and can we change that? That seems like one of the struggles over the coming years is, can we change those metrics of growth? So we look at life expectancy, we look at literacy, we look at access to potable water, we look at nutrition levels, we look at health levels, we look at social mobility, where people have the ability to move into areas of interest in the economy that they're interested in, rather than the profit lines of a handful of corporations, right? That how do we recenter the idea of a human-centered growth as you talked about it? I'd say a human and an ecological centered growth, because humans are part of the ecosystem,
Yes.
right? We're not somehow separate from nature.
No,
And that's interesting. I'd love to hear, and because I think this really comes up in Nigeria as well, which obviously has been an area of focus for you, though, which is, there's probably more, but to simplify it here, kind of two levels of where that power can be centered. So there's the question of how does Nigeria as a nation gain control of its energy future? So instead of having an extractive relationship with shale oil and the historical fossil fuel industry, how does Nigeria benefits from its own resources in a way that lifts its people up? But then inside of Nigeria, there's also questions of indigenous populations who've been kind of on the sharp end of that stick as well. And how do those questions of justice also work out? Because it's not enough just that there's because I also think that those are central when we talk about a just transition. If we're not bringing back people rights to their own land and their own sovereignty within nation states, I think we still also find a fatal flaw in the ability to go to a just transition. Again, I think it's a practical as well as moral question.
Yeah. So I was speaking with a scholar of Africana studies from Cornell, I think last week, and this conversation came up around we're not trying to replace capitalism with black capitalism, right? So when you have conversation with amongst like black colleagues and the conversation around capitalism comes up, what you sense amongst, and I mean both practitioners and even like academic scholars, folks seem to think that it's a call for black capitalism. But no, it's not about, let's do away with Shell and replace it with Dangote Industries because Dangote is a fellow Nigerian. No, that's not the issue. The issue, like we said, is central. How do we get people and the environment to be at one, at a productive, more meaningful level? It's not primarily about whether the person doing the extraction is Shell or Dangote.
Yeah.
It's primarily about how do we ensure that indigenous communities have an avenue for productivity, for improved living. Now, at a practical level, how do we ensure that? I think it's in getting our rhetorics right. And that's why, I'm happy that you raised that question and made that distinction. Yes, away with Shell, away with foreign extractive companies. But it's not about replacing them with indigenous form of colonization. It's not. And the primary way, again, I say that to achieve this, first of all, clearly, especially amongst scholars and writers and thinkers, is to be as clear as possible in the things that we want, in the things that we're asking for, in the positions that we're putting forward. It's not a replacement of foreign white extraction with black indigenous extraction. That's a message that should always come out clearly. Because at the end of it, I don't think that people who are exploited and even the environment would care whether, the person destroying them is, coming from Europe, Netherlands, or coming from, Lagos or Abuja or any of the big cities. So I think it's in getting that message out as clearly and as well defined as possible so that there is no confusion as to what is being demanded or what is being put forward.
Yeah, tainted water is just as tainted, regardless of who's responsible, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. The desert is just as dry. I mean, to me, that's one of the things, and one of the reasons why we started this podcast and trying to amplify voices from the global South and extend that to indigenous peoples around the world, including native folks in the U.S. and North America and so forth. I mean, to me, that question of land back and sovereignty is a core climate solution, just because of everything that we've been talking about, and that's true everywhere. That's certainly true in the United States. In North America, I've read studies that say native resistance to pipelines and other forms of fossil fuel extraction have probably resulted in 25% less carbon emissions than otherwise would have taken place. So already I would argue that the most effective resistance to climate change in North America is native resistance. And there's a continued effort to undermine native sovereignty here on many levels to continue to extract those resources out. And I think that that's true around the world. And that obviously brings up questions of biodiversity, because 5% of the world's population is indigenous, overseeing 80% of the world's biodiversity. I mean, you go down the list, and I think this question of local sovereignty is really one of the core questions. Again, I keep bringing this up, not just from an ethical and a moral level, although that should be enough to get people to move, but from a practical level, that if we don't return sovereignty, I don't think we get there. I think we fail. I think the whole mission fails. And that's something that I want to see really centered in the climate movement universally. And NGOs, academics, activists, policymakers across that we have to reorient towards that question of returning sovereignty to indigenous people around the world, or we don't get there. That we have to rethink about how we've built all these things. I think for me, one of the things that's changed is I came from kind of it's probably not surprising, a left, socialist left background is how I got into politics. And I think that one of the weaknesses that can happen there, and one of the things that I've been trying to step away from, is the idea that there is a single model, there's a single solution, right? That if you follow this plan, doesn't matter what country you're in, what continent, what circumstance, this is the way that we're going to get to a better world. One of the things that I think I've just thrown that away, because I don't think that kind of top-down thinking works even from a left point of view any better than it does from a right point of view. And that I really feel that the real solutions to a sustainable future are going to be 1,000-fold, 10,000-fold. That different communities and different populations and different cultural backgrounds and different environmental conditions are going to lead to different solutions. And it's how do we support and collaborate and learn from each other, rather than trying to impose a single model saying this is how it works going forward, right? So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that, because I think that's going to be really, really critical, is that and I say this after talking at a long stretch, but that we learn to listen in the global north, right? That we learn to listen and learn critically.
Yes. And I think that, to the point you just made, I think that's why even the journey to sustainability, the specifics of it, would be different from community to community. It would be different from one society to another, because, like you said, the central theme, or one of the central themes, is returning sovereignty to the people, and trusting that as much as we are experts and we've got all the degrees and all of that, you must be able to trust the people to know what their needs are, and to let them lead the work. And the job of the expert is to support them. But the central theme of defining their needs we must let the community take the lead for that. So as experts, as advocates, as activists, it is to understand that while the global theme and the global objective is the same: a sustainable world, a sustainable world where climate change is checked. That's the common theme globally, and all experts, all advocates, all activists are on the same page with that. But what that would look like from community to community, we must have, the humility to let the people take ownership, and our job is to support them. Our job is to provide them with whatever skill that they say they need.
Exactly, because clearly we do need technology to get through this, right? And some of that technology is going to come from people coming from, technically leading universities and so forth. But I also think that if we ignore indigenous technologies and knowledge, we've thrown away millennia of knowledge. I mean,
yeah. It's a whole generation of knowledge that would be wasted, because one thing that we must understand is these are communities that have survived from generation to generation. There is institutional knowledge, there is institutional skill set. It may not be in the way that the formal education is codified, and there's a library with books, and there's a research center with millions of grants. They may not have that, but there is as much or even much more institutional knowledge, and our job is to help them in the ways that they need our help. Our job is to let them take ownership of that. It's your community. It's you own it. How do you want us to help? How, and one of the things, and I think I believe it's that the Paris Agreement of the UNFCCC actually did specifically mention that there is a need to ensure that I can't remember the specific word, but it's to the effect that the development of indigenous technologies that have been there before, the job is not just to say, oh, we'll give you this, we'll give you this, we'll give you this, because that's not new, right? Using Africa as dumping ground for old technologies, for technologies that the times have evolved beyond, or technologies that have proven to be not as useful, right? So the use of these communities as dumping ground for such technologies. No, that's not what we want. That's not what we're talking about. It's about, as a community, what's the best, basically giving them ownership. If the Ogoni community says, we do not want the extraction of crude oil here, this is what we want, this is what we want, are we listening to them? Or are we saying, no, the Ogoni people, you do not know what's good for your economy. Oil is good, so we have to extract. Or we have to start a plant here. It's to listen to each of these communities and try to understand how the institutional knowledge, the institutional objectives can be supported, can be best supported, and just understanding, like you said, even for me as an African, as a Black person, there's that tendency towards the tyranny of expertise. To feel like, I've gone to school, guys. I know these things, but the humility to be able to understand that sovereignty belongs to the people. Sovereignty belongs to the people.
And also, I think that knowledge is globally valuable, because literally it's not just generations; it's often millennia of generations of knowledge about a piece of land. And I think of every acre of rainforest that's felled, how much biological wealth was destroyed. We will never even know we lost it. How many, if we think of it even in terms of selfish human perspective, how many medicines, how many foods, how many that might survive in a heating planet, how many incredible billions of years of biological information and resources are just destroyed and burned, never to be seen again, so someone could grab a little chunk of gold or mineral under there. I think we need to start looking at that indigenous knowledge of technologies and food raising and land maintenance and see it as just as vital. In the U.S., where I'm more familiar with it, the specifics, for instance, a lot of Native folks had a very different way of dealing with fire control, and we're only just starting to realize that they were. Sorry, not to curse. I'll try not to curse on the podcast. But they were right, right? Oh, big surprise. Thousands of years of successful land management, and then a couple hundred years where everything went to hell, right? And that knowledge is actually, to me, is social human knowledge, and that elevating that indigenous technology and expertise is also going to be vital for us figuring out how to make it through this transition, right? That knowledge is invaluable and irreplaceable and so specific to a culture being able to survive, right? When you whip away a language and a culture, even if the people are alive but displaced, that knowledge is just gone and impossible to regain, right? Because it came out of thousands of years of living.
And I think it comes from a place of what we seem to value and what we seem to place esteem on. So there's been land management in these communities for thousands of years, right? But because that, and I'm not using this as a buzzword, but that colonial ego of, oh, this is the way we do it, and this is the way we have managed our land. Now there's trouble in your land, and I think it's our land management system that has to apply in managing your land, and then I ignore the land management systems from generation to generation. So it's that arrogance of, I'm coming to colonize you, I'm coming to tell you who you should be and how you should do. And that affects not just, it's very obvious in the social context, but it's affecting even environmental management principles and environmental management systems. And that's why we're seeing all the fallout that we are now seeing today.
Yeah. And that's, again, that humility is the word you used, and I think that we all need to learn, which is the first thing is to listen and learn. And if you don't listen and learn, you'll never learn, right? You'll never know the knowledge that you're forgoing. You'll never know the value that's there. Looking across these things, what are some of the things that gives you, or particular movements or progress that gives you the most hope right now? Including social movements and struggle and resistance. What gives you the greatest hope going forward?
I think for me, the greatest hope is the people. So I do not think that there's an increase in technical knowledge of climate science within African communities yet. But I do see an increase in the number of local movements and local groups who are coming together for different environmental efforts. And that encourages me. That shows that while, the knowledge may be incomplete, while they may not have the same knowledge as somebody who's, studied this thing may have, but there's a consciousness. There's a consciousness, and that encourages me. There are organizations that are coming up, doing different efforts at preserving the environment, and for me that's encouraging. So they do not get the same traction and the same publicity that some of the bigger organizations or bigger figures get, but there's been a number of community organizations that you see around communities in Africa, and that encourages me. I think the second thing that encourages me would be the last COP that was held last year. Was the global goal on adaptation. And I know for a fact that there are efforts to work towards an African submission on what does adaptation mean for the African region. And I know some of the folks who are involved in that effort, and the amount of work that's going on encourages me. So I think those are the two main things. The fact that the community, the people that we talk about, the people who have to lead these efforts, the people who, they have to take over their sovereignty, they're actually beginning to do that. It's at a relatively small level. They're not getting like media coverage and all of that, but it's okay. They are doing their work. and that encourages me. But also, secondly, the effort at the subnational level of the African Union and the African group of negotiators towards the global goal of adaptation. So that those two would be the main things that encourages me that there is hope and that the just transition would progress.
And that really, to me, sums up the kind of the two, they're not really spheres, but the two directions that clearly climate requires global cooperation.
True.
It requires global treaties and agreements. It requires also flow of resources, which is what one of the things exciting about COP is the most recent COP is the potential. At least we're starting to move towards people saying that we need to fund these mechanisms, right? So, because without the resources, how do we implement real adaptation and mitigation strategies? What you brought up, those two areas of hope, are really the kind of the two directions: the need for top-down international cooperation, treaties, ones that need to be funded so that actually the work can be done, but also from the bottom up, where we start to build local resistance and struggle to fight for the kind of just transition that we've talked about. But to me, it's also very practical, the kind of resilient local networks where people are solving on a local basis, energy creation and distribution, food resources, water resources, that as climate impacts escalate, if people don't have that local resiliency and those local networks built, the top-down solutions that'll come will not be just, right? They'll be kind of relief efforts, which are not a way towards thriving, right?
And they will tend to be too generalized to be useful.
Yeah.
So it's helpful that we have those local efforts and local resistance, because apart from just resisting, they are also redirecting. So what we see with this local community efforts is it's not just stop doing this. It's about this is what we want. So they're also defining, or they are redefining and redirecting. So they're not just like resistant groups, they're also redirecting groups. So that it's very useful because while you have the top-down efforts and the top-down approach, having that alone will lead to just having generalized ideologies and generalized approach that become too watery to be effective at the local level. But when you have efforts at the local level and you have, the top efforts, what you have is hopefully a coordinated effort that ensures that the things that you need to do at a general scale are being done. And yet, at the local level, you have, the minor specifics and the redirection that's necessary to be effective.
One of the projects that I'm hoping to undertake over the next couple of years is helping to build ways to share that knowledge and amplify those efforts so that we can benefit across borders from this knowledge and from what works. What works in an urban setting, and how does that translate from, one continent to another, what works in a rural setting. There's going to be solutions that are completely local, but there's also going to be so much knowledge to learn in terms of agriculture, in terms of technology, in terms of energy and water and land usage and all of these things. And that's what I hope, is that we start seeing a bottom-up blossoming of knowledge, indigenous and otherwise, that can help us find a way through, the other side of this crisis that we're seeing. So that those efforts, I hope we can find ways for that knowledge to get shared. What would you say if and it's okay if you don't have something specific for this, but I'm just to activists and people in the movement and the NGOs and academics, how would you ask or direct people to being able to shift this balance? Because I don't think that Global South voices, indigenous voices, people in the frontline communities all over the world have not been centered in the climate conversation enough. there's been progress, as you've talked about, in terms of international negotiations. But is there anything that you would ask folks like me and other folks to do to kind of shift that balance? Again, both because it's morally right and because if we don't, I think we lose everything. So is there anything that you think people could be doing differently, or things that we should be paying attention to, or lessons that we could learn that would help?
Okay, so I'm going to bring in some of my broader social concerns to this conversation to answer your question. So I think when we think of success, and just give me a minute, I'm going somewhere with this. When we think of
Okay.
success, we need to ask ourselves the power play that leads to that thing we're defining as success. So I would tell you, as an academic, you want to cite a paper. The papers that are more likely to gain visibility are going to be papers written in specific universities that we all know of. Your Ivy Leagues, Oxbridge, those kinds of universities. But that does not necessarily mean that there isn't a paper as brilliant or even more brilliant that has been written but does not have the same visibility. The same thing, you think of activists, you think of advocates, you think of even practitioners. The people that come to your mind, or the people that you would easily see, are folks who have the necessary power balance to give them visibility. They are not necessarily the people doing the most important work, but they are part of Chatham House. They are part of this think tank and that think tank that has visibility. So their work gets promoted. And what do I do when I want to cite somebody? I go for the most visible, the most easy to find. So I think my word to academics, activists, and what have you is for us to do the work that's necessary and dig deeper. Because what we end up doing is we give visibility to already visible people. So there are, there's a young climate activist in Europe that everybody knows their name, but there are 1,001 just as young or probably younger environmental advocates and activists in Africa who are doing real work that nobody knows about because the power imbalance is not in their favor. So the job that we need to do, and I really, really do appreciate you, Sam and Harold, for the work you're doing with this podcast in trying to amplify voices and give visibility to folks who ordinarily would not gain visibility. And I think that's the kind of work that we all need to be doing. We cannot run podcasts, but it could be in your own role as an academic. Really, ask yourself, question yourself, who are the scholars that I am citing? How do I cite scholars who have done just as important and meaningful work, but may not have this visibility? If you're somebody who runs a seminar series or a conference, who are the scholars you're inviting? Who are the activists you're inviting? Who are the advocates you're inviting? Yes, you want to have the big names, but there's a need to ask ourselves, these names, these big names, these visible names, they're not necessarily big because they're doing meaningful work or impactful work. It's the power imbalance that amplifies them. So how do I do the hard work or the deep work of giving visibility and giving voice to folks who ordinarily would not get visibility? Because again, it's not jamboree. It's not just about having the right rhetoric. We're seeking folks who are doing effective work, and they may not necessarily be people who are popular. If you do certain things on certain level, your name is more likely to be heard. But what about folks who are doing just as important work, but nobody knows them? So my plea would be for us to do the hard work of bringing out otherwise buried voices, otherwise buried faces, and how do we, dig them up and give them the visibility that they deserve and that their work deserves.
That's a great mission statement for what we're trying to do. But I'm learning. I mean, for myself, one of the things that excited me about starting this podcast was obviously I'm hoping that we can build up an audience inside the movement as well as a more general audience, but especially inside the movement to bring voices that aren't being centered into this. But one of the most exciting aspects of it for me personally is the ability for me to learn from people like you, right? To go out and hear voices that I wasn't being exposed to and gain that knowledge. And I think that's, as you said, just to dig deeper and to redress those power imbalances about who is heard is something that I think the entire movement needs to learn. And that's something I'm hoping that we can do with this podcast and some of our broader media efforts is do what we can to amplify, but also to be arguing with the rest of the movement that everybody needs to be doing that work. Everybody needs to be doing that work. To that end, if there's any sources of some of these voices, if there's anything that you would like us to share, both along with this podcast, but more generally, please feel free to send them to Sam and I. And that ongoing, we would love to hear if you're like, oh, you should check this out. I don't mean to put extra labor on your plate, but if there's anything in the short term that's easy to share, that's something we're rebuilding our entire website. We used to be called Climate Now Project. We're going into Undeniable as more of a media channel. One of the things I want to do that we've been talking about doing with the website is using it to just share other voices, right? That it's not just content that we're making. So I think that this has got my wheels spinning in terms of just some of the specificity of what you went into, how we can do this. So, and to that end also, is if there's anyone else that you think might be interested in being on the podcast that you think would be a good voice to talk to, we would love your recommendations. I think that's going to be where we get some of our best guests, is connecting us with other people. But I hope so. I thank you. You've been extremely generous with your time and with your knowledge and with your expertise. But I'd love to kind of open it up now. If there's anything else that you'd like, that you'd like to address, or anything you'd like to close with. We don't have to close. We can go I could talk to you forever, but you probably have other things you need to do. So I'll give you the opportunity to find a last thing to talk on if you'd like to, for as long as you'd like to.
No, thank you. I think we've covered most of the issues that are close to my heart and my work as a professional. So it's been a real pleasure. I think one of the things I would just like to repeat is the fact that as we think around these issues, just transition, is to understand that just transition, sustainable development is good, not just as a moral initiative, as a moral necessity, but also for survival. And it's good for the economy, but not the economy in traditional terms, but the economy as, how do we better the people and their relationship with the environment and the quality of life that they lead. So I think that really, really would be my closing message, that transition is necessary, both as a moral necessity, but also as basic survival need in order to sustain our civilization and sustain our economy, but not economy just in terms of figures